Hi, it's Penny here, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of November. Now, if you follow along with my videos, you might have noticed that I didn't post a December TBR, and that's because I read so little in November that I'm still catching up on my November TBR in December. Although I still did read 7 books, that's not so bad, it's just a lot less than I was planning. But given everything else that was happening in November, I'm not mad about it. As usual, I am going to do this book battle style where I pair up all the books and I battle them against each other until we get to the best book of the month. So firstly, I'm actually going to do a battle of 3 with all my middle grade books that I read. So we've got Under the Smokestrewn Sky by Seanan Mcguire, up against Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, and Stacey's Mistake by Ellen Crenshaw. So firstly, Under the Smokestrewn Sky by Seanan Mcguire. This is the 4th book in the Up and Under series. Oh, I just said Seanan Mcguire. It's actually by A. Deborah Baker. So this series, the concept is amazing. Basically, A. Deborah Baker is a character in the Middle Game series by Seanan Mcguire, and in that series, A. Deborah Baker writes this set of children's books in order to get ideas into like the common population's belief system, so that then she can do alchemy based on those beliefs. It's a really cool idea, and then Seanan Mcguire was going to go and write these books into real life, which I was super excited about, and I did really like the first book in the series. The second one went downhill, the third one maybe went up a little bit, but still wasn't great, and I think I actually said I was going to DNF the series after reading that third one, but then the 4th one came out and they're such short, quick books to read. I thought, why not give it a go and finish the series off? I'm just bad at DNFing things and really into completing series at the moment. And I am glad that I finished it off just for that completionist feeling. However, this still wasn't that great. I really feel like this series, basically in each book, they're moving through different sections of this world, and each section is ruled by a different element. I really think the whole book could have been like packed down into a single book with just a few chapters in each element, because that's about how much plot you've got. I also don't feel like any of the characters in this feel particularly well developed. So in this book, where some of the things come together and there's some reveals and some conclusions, they don't feel as impactful as I think they could have if the characters had been better developed. And the problem is that Seanan Mcguire doesn't really focus on the plot or on the character development. She's more focused on what she calls digressions in this book. So it's a very self-aware type narration, and every chance she has, she inserts a digression that goes on kind of a little bit of social commentary. And in some of Seanan Mcguire's other books, I've really enjoyed that. Like, there's a lot of it in Middle Game, and I love Middle Game. I even read it again after I disliked the series, and I still loved it in Middle Game. And I think some of the Wayward Children books do it, and I love it in those. Maybe not in the later books, but I have loved it. This one though, I just felt like a lot of the digressions were a stretch in terms of relating it back into the story, and so instead of adding to the story and giving it more depth, it just felt like a distraction. So I haven't even talked about what the series is about. Basically, we follow these 2 kids, Avery and Zib. Avery is very straight-laced, followed the rules, and Zib is more out there and a bit more chaotic. They end up getting lost on their way to school and going over this wall, where they end up in the Up and Under, where they have to follow the improbable road to get to the impossible city and save the day. In a lot of ways, it is that typical kind of fairy tale, but the world does have a lot of really interesting elements, and I'm just so frustrated that all the potential of this series was not really delivered on. So I think a lot of people have dropped off this series. I saw a lot of people talking about it in the beginning, and I don't see hardly anyone having read this last book. So it's a shame, but that's what it is. Then I read Howl's Moving Castle, and I'm actually right at the moment in the middle of filming a vlog where I read the whole trilogy following on from the Howl's Moving Castle book. I had previously read Howl's Moving Castle, so this is a reread, which means it is not eligible to win the book battle. And as expected, I had a lot of fun on my reread. I do think this is very rereadable. So in this, we're following this girl named Sophie, whose family owns a hat store, and she kind of doesn't have much expectations because she is the oldest of 3 sisters, and everybody knows that the oldest is never really going to succeed if they go out to seek their fortune, so she pretty much just expects to be a bit of a failure for her whole life. But then she ends up being cursed by the Wicked Witch of the Waste and pretty much forced to go out and seek her fortune. She comes across Howl's Moving Castle and then ends up staying there with him and his apprentice and his fire demon assistant, and they get to know each other. There's also a bunch of stuff going on with the king and Sophie's younger two sisters, and the way that it all came together was very satisfying. There's so many pieces and so many mysteries, and even though most of the time you're kind of just having fun in this moving castle, it does all come together in a really satisfying and complete way. And the whole book is just really whimsical and really fun, and I really enjoyed it. It is different from the movie. If you've only seen the movie, I would recommend the book. I think they've got a similar feel, even if the story in this has a bit more to it. I definitely think you would like both of them, and this is definitely one I recommend reading. Then lastly, for middle grade books, I picked up the graphic novel adaptation of Stacey's Mistake. So this is one of the graphic novel adaptations of the Babysitters Club books, which were my favorite series when I was a young girl, basically following this group of babysitters and their hijinks and adventures, and along the way they tend to learn a lot as well. In this one we're following Stacey. So she has moved back to New York. In the first books she's just new from New York in this small town where they live, but then she moved back to New York, and in this one the rest of the babysitters come to her town to help her with this big group babysitting task, as well as the idea is that they will just have some fun. The babysitters can meet Stacey's New York friends and just have a good time looking around New York. But right from the beginning, Stacey is just embarrassed by her friends and the way they're acting about New York. One of them's like a massive fangirl tourist, another one is just afraid of everything. Her best friend from the Babysitters Club is really jealous of her best friend in New York, so like it's just going really badly, and she starts to think that maybe inviting her friends to New York was a mistake. So it's been a while since I read the original, and I actually felt like, even though I remember the broad concept of the original book, it's probably been like 20 years since I read it at least. But even though I remembered the broad concepts, a lot of the details I don't remember. So I can't really say much about how this has been adapted, but I still think it's a really fun series. The art is really bright and fun and clear, and I think all the different babysitters' personalities are really well represented, and it gets the point across. The only thing I would say is what I've pretty much said with every single one of these, is that it's hard to get into the depth of the lessons that these books go into in such a short little book. Like in a graphic novel, you just don't have many words to work with, you know? But that said, I also know the originals probably don't stand up in modern times, so it's nice to have a modern adaptation. So I had a lot of fun with that, but I'm always going to have fun with these regardless. I will also say, like, the artists or authors that they have for each of these just keeps changing all the time, and I don't know why that is. I'm kind of suspicious about it, but it is in the style of the original Babysitters Club books, which most of them were ghostwritten, and even though the author was officially Anne Martin, a lot of them were written by other people, actually, because the original books were coming out one a month, which is super exciting for me as a kid, but not particularly sustainable for a single author. So if I'm putting these three books up against each other, I think obviously we can take out Under the Smokestrewn Sky because it wasn't good. I'm kind of conflicted really about whether I should put forward Howl's Moving Castle, knowing it can't actually win, even though objectively it was better than this Babysitters Club book, just because this is simple contemporary and this is amazing fantasy. Like, actually the way the magic works in this as well is really cool. Not a particularly hard magic system, but still very whimsical and fun. So, I mean, I guess I enjoyed this more, so this will go through to the finals. Okay, then we're going to have two books which are more typical of my taste, like more typical fantasy and science fiction. Both of them by older authors that I read a lot of when I was younger. In my 20s, I mean. Not as young as when I read this. So we have The Girl Who Heard Dragons by Anne McCaffrey up against Crown of Stars by Kate Elliott. So The Girl Who Heard Dragons, this is a short story anthology, and I think from the cover and the title I was expecting it to have a lot of Pern short stories. So Pern is Anne McCaffrey's long-running series about these dragons that can shoot thread out of the air. So thread is this regular occurrence where this stuff falls from the sky that basically destroys everything it touches, and dragons are basically keeping everybody alive, and we're mostly following, I guess, the adventures of the dragon riders. It's a really interesting series, although I often struggle with Anne McCaffrey's writing style, actually not just in that series, in a lot of these short stories. I often feel like she's just writing things in an overcomplicated way. I'm not sure if it's because she wants to try and sound more intelligent, or if that was just the writing style at the time, especially in science fiction. Because I should also say, I think a lot of the times when people talk about the Dragon Riders of Pern, it comes across as a fantasy series, and it kind of is, but there's a lot of science fiction elements as well, especially once you start learning about the history of the world and start moving into the future. And it's really hard for me to review this book because the first short story, the longest one, was set in that world of Pern, and I kind of wish I'd read it more when I'd been reading those books originally, because I think I would have gotten a lot more out of it at that point. But then for a lot of the other short stories, we also had some set in her Brainships world, which is a world where some of the spaceships have people's brains installed in them and thinking beings, as well as spaceships. And I think I liked a lot of those. There were also some other random ones that I really hated and didn't feel like they had a point. There were quite a few where I felt like there must be another series out there which has all the context that I'm missing for these stories, but I actually think the stories either just didn't make sense or there isn't any context anywhere. There were some really clever ones, some really cool ones, some that I really loved, but other ones I just didn't enjoy, didn't think made any sense, didn't seem to have a point. So I'm quite conflicted about it. Also, even the ones that I liked, I still struggle with her writing style. And just also in general, I don't tend to like short stories, so I don't know. I did in my vlog of this book go through the plot summaries of each short story as I got to it, so if you are particularly interested, you could check that out. But this probably isn't one I'd particularly recommend unless Anne McCaffrey is someone you have an interest in reading more of. Or maybe if you particularly like short stories, or if you particularly like older science fiction. Okay, then I did finish another series, so I read Crown of Stars by Kate Elliott. This is the 7th book in the Crown of Stars series. This is an epic fantasy series. All the books are really chunky, and I do feel, again, a little bit conflicted about this one. I still feel like the book series, to me, really climaxed in the 5th book, and I wish that some of the things that came together in the final 2 books had somehow been restructured to happen more closely to the events in that 5th book. And I just think in general there's so much going on in this series that when it does all come together in a very satisfying way, it's still so far since you learn about a lot of those things that, for me at least, I felt like I'd forgotten a lot of the things, so I don't think I got the satisfaction of everything coming together that I could have. Maybe if I had read this series more quickly, I would have got that, but admittedly it took me a long time to finish the series because it's really long, you know? And I do struggle again with Kate Elliott's writing style. I just find it a little bit dense. I did start listening to the audiobooks and they weren't too bad, but I also feel like even though the audiobooks helped me get through it, it is harder to pick up on all the details when you're listening to an audiobook, so that probably hurt me that way as well. Still, even though there are parts of the series that I didn't really like, parts that I really struggled with, and I wish that things had been restructured, I still think if you're wanting an epic fantasy, this is a really good one. It has some really cool ideas in it. It is kind of the typical thing where we've got a bunch of people fighting over the throne, but we've also got this maths or astronomy based magic and these dark magicians who have a bunch of schemes going on underneath things. We also have a bunch of different mythological creatures who get involved and like different dimensions. There's cool stuff going on in it, and I really liked it. I think it could have been better. So, if I am putting these 2 books up against each other, it's a hard one. I actually think though, I'm going to pick Crown of Stars just because it was a very satisfying ending. And that is what I was looking for from that series conclusion. So, Crown of Stars through to the final. Okay, then for our last battle, I'm going to call these my cringy books, but cringy in very different ways. So firstly, we've got Tombs by Junji Ito, up against Love and Pain by Ben Gillies and Chris Joannou. So let's start with Tombs. This is a Junji Ito short story anthology. Junji Ito does horror manga, and these are just a bunch of really creepy stories done in typical Junji Ito style. I still would say Uzumaki, which I have here, is my favorite Junji Ito, but I felt like out of the short story anthologies that I have read by him, this was probably one of my favorites. I think a lot of the stories stuck out for me, and there were just so many like really horrific body horror type things happening, and just like horrible creatures and just concepts that make you think, oh. I spent so much time just like showing the pictures of what I was reading to my partner, and he was like, what are you reading? Like, it's gross, but I love it. If you like Junji Ito, I definitely recommend this anthology. If you don't, and maybe Uzumaki seems a bit too fat for you to try, maybe try Tombs. Okay, then we have Love and Pain. So this is a memoir written by two of the members of Silverchair, which was one of my favorite bands when I was younger. Actually, I think when I was 15, maybe my favorite band, the band that got me into playing guitar. I love them. I wrote a whole fan fiction, science fiction fan fiction about them. I used to listen to their albums over and over. I really love them. However, I do think I dropped off listening to the band for their last album or two, and I was never really aware of any drama that might have gone on when they broke up, but now I am very aware of it, and I kind of wish I wasn't. So this book is only written by the drummer and the bassist, who have very strong feelings about the guitarist, especially the drummer. The drummer is very bitter about everything that's gone on, and even though the book kind of tries to write it in a balanced way, like admitting that this is only their perspective and they realize that Daniel's perspective would be different, still the bitterness comes across. Also, just like so many of the stories that they're telling about their rock star days just seem like old men telling bullshit stories. A lot of the things they're doing is just like they're explaining it like it's these amazing epic things that happened to them when they were younger, but a lot of it is just really juvenile and stupid. And admittedly, at the time, they were 15 to 20-year-old boys, so like, sure, be immature and juvenile, that's how old you are. But as 40-year-old men, looking back on that time and writing the story, I would expect a little bit more perspective. And there was a bit, so they talk a lot about like their alcoholism and their drug use, and those parts I thought were written with a lot of perspective. So then it was a little bit confusing when they would talk about like dancing naked at parties that it didn't really seem appropriate at, and like other stupid stuff. It just seemed very immature and kind of like lacking in self-awareness as well. Like the story is told in alternating-ish chapters between Ben and Chris, although I think there were more Ben chapters in there, but then also throughout it there are little in-between stories whose perspective is not really clear, like it's written from a more of a we perspective, and those jump around in time, and I think it just made everything seem even more confusing. There was some interesting things in this book about their creative process and signing with a label and all that stuff, but to be honest, I feel like Ben and Chris mostly weren't aware of a lot of that, so there wasn't much of it. And just overall, this book didn't make me respect them more, which is what I would want a memoir of my favourite band to do. So that was a shame. So obviously, if I'm putting Tombs up against Love and Pain, we are going to pick Tombs by Junji Ito to go through to the final. So now let's do the final battle. We've got 3 books. We've got Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones up against Crown of Stars by Kate Elliott and Tombs by Junji Ito. So, firstly, we're going to take away Howl's Moving Castle because it's a reread. It's not allowed to win, although I suspect it might have if it was allowed. So then we've got Crown of Stars versus Tombs, and I'm definitely going to pick Tombs. It was just so creepy, and a lot of those stories are going to stick with me, especially the one with the slugs. Anyway, that is all the books that I read in the month of November. Do let me know if you've read any of them. I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments, or let me know what other great things you've read in the month of November. And do subscribe if you would like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.